Hey everyone, this is the video lecture for our unit on identity politics and recognition using the work of Charles Taylor and K. Anthony Appiah. So we're going to start with Charles Taylor's article called The Politics of Recognition. To begin with, Taylor talks a little bit about the idea of recognition and how it's become important within politics and also within personal understandings of identity. So he starts his article, I'm just going to read a little bit of the first couple paragraphs, pointing out that in contemporary politics and in contemporary political philosophy, the idea of recognition and the demand of people to be recognized by others has become increasingly important. And he notes that this is because people have increasingly understood that although we do have a lot of power to become who we want to be and to create ourselves in the way that we want, we don't have all the power in our situations of identity. Right? Part of who we are is constituted by other people. People see us in certain ways and recognize us as being certain ways, and that can, for better or worse, influence our identity. Because we might have a personal identity, how we see ourselves, but we also have to acknowledge that our identity is at least partly based upon how other people see us and how other people treat us. And so Taylor is concerned about trying to make sure that people are recognized in the appropriate way, in a way which takes into account both the inherent worth and dignity of individuals, but also, he thinks, takes into account the collective identities that a person might be a part of and the differences that might be valuable. And so it's about trying to navigate what he calls appropriate recognition and minimize misrecognition, being recognized in an inappropriate way or as something that a person is not or doesn't want to be. Key to the way that Taylor understands issues of identity is the difference, which has become increasingly noteworthy in contemporary Western liberal democracies, for example, like the United States or his test case Canada, between prioritizing equality and equal rights and prioritizing people's demand for recognition of their identities and differences. And so this brings up the difference between two ways of viewing politics and the politics of identity and recognition. The first being what he calls the politics of equality and dignity. And this has been the dominant view in Western liberal democracies for quite some time now. And this is a view which focuses on the inherent equality and inherent dignity of all human beings. And so it's a focus on equal rights, equal treatment, equal recognition. The potential danger that Taylor acknowledges and really thinks is a problem, and other people perhaps less so, but Taylor is a little bit more concerned with this, is that in our efforts to prioritize equality, we sometimes can lose cultural difference, cultural distinctness, and personal identity, right? That it can have a kind of homogenizing effect, where we no longer want to acknowledge difference because we might be afraid that it will impede our efforts at prioritizing equality. So that has been the dominant view. And Taylor contrasts that with a newer approach, which he has noticed in contemporary politics and contemporary political philosophy, which he calls the politics of identity or difference. And so politics of identity focuses on maintaining a view that respects the inherent equality of human beings, but holds that to be alongside a respect for identity and difference. So the idea is that we should respect different cultures and different, what he and Appiah will call collective identity groups, and view them as important. Right? Taylor uses as his example cultural identity of the French Canadians in Quebec, but collective identity groups include things like racial groups, gender groups, sexual orientation, any kind of religion, any kind of collective identity that a person might identify with or that a person might be identified with. And so in the politics of identity and difference, the goal, according to Taylor, is to maintain an appreciation and a focus on equal rights while also valuing, recognizing, and holding to be politically important key collective identities, cultural differences, etc. Right. So he claims that we ought to value difference alongside an identity alongside equality. There is, of course, a potential downside to identity politics, that being that it becomes difficult, and Taylor acknowledges this towards the end of his article, to recognize every culture, every difference that a person might find valuable. Appiah makes a lot more of the potential problems of identity politics or the politics of difference in his article, so we'll hold off on that a little bit. Taylor does recognize them, but at the end of the day, he is a bit more amenable to the politics of identity and difference than he is to the politics of equality and dignity. So the question that Taylor is trying to answer is it possible to value equal rights but also value identity and difference within the context of a Western liberal democracy? He takes as a starting point the idea that Western liberal democracy is valuable, that we should maintain the sort of political culture that we have in many Western liberal democracies like the United States and Canada. And so the question becomes, can I maintain that kind of political system while also valuing identity and difference, and perhaps valuing it in such a way that the government can take interventions in order to protect and raise up certain cultural or collective identity differences. And Taylor's argument is that it is possible to value identity and rights, that the government should value cultural differences and collective identity groups, and does have a role to play in maintaining cultural differences, helping collective identity groups to survive and flourish within a society, etc. The way that Taylor argues for the government's ability to prioritize both rights and identity is to point out that there is a difference between fundamental liberties or fundamental rights and non-fundamental liberties or rights, which he calls privileges. So he says, in just sort of an effort to define these terms, that fundamental rights or liberties are those rights that should never be infringed and therefore ought to be unassailably entrenched. So the idea here is that there are some rights which are fundamental and which it is not appropriate for the government to infringe upon, even if doing so would help a culture that is, for example, in danger of dying out or something like that. On the other hand, he says there are some things which are privileges or immunities. They are not fundamental rights, and so it is appropriate sometimes for a government to revoke or restrict these privileges or immunities through public policy for the purpose of prioritizing identity and difference and the survival of cultures in particular. The example that Taylor uses to kind of explain all of these ideas is the example of Quebec. This is his kind of test case. He's Canadian. So the kind of situation in Quebec in, I think it was in the 90s, was that Quebec, it has a large French-speaking population. Canada is mostly English-speaking, but there's a substantial French-Canadian population centered around Quebec. And so the Quebecois people wanted to make sure that their culture and their specific way of life was maintained by asking to be exempt from certain laws that were upheld in Canada via the Canadian Charter of Rights. So they requested certain special protections for Canadian culture, for French Canadian culture. They requested certain exemptions from some of the requirements that existed in the Canadian Charter of Rights for the express purpose of helping to maintain French Canadian or Quebec identity and helping French Canadian culture survive. Taylor uses this test case to argue that it is appropriate to sometimes make these exceptions or provide these protections. Right. So in Quebec, the main things that the French Canadians were asking for revolved around education and language. And so this is a good model for looking, again, at this difference between fundamental rights and privileges. So one of the areas is education. And the French Canadians requested, and they did eventually receive, the ability to limit the access to education of French Canadians in Quebec to French schools only. The argument from other folks in Canada was that, no, we have a right to education, and so people in Quebec should be able to educate their children however they want. But here is an area where Taylor would say there's a difference between a fundamental right and a privilege or immunity. So, for example, he says there's a fundamental right to education. You cannot infringe upon that, but the language in which that education is delivered falls under these privileges or immunities. It's not a fundamental right to be educated in English. Right. So he argues that it is acceptable for the Quebecois government to require all education of French Canadian children to be held in French and to not provide public schools in English. Another example centered around language again is that in Quebec, all signage and menus and all that kind of thing is provided only in French and not in English. The argument was that if you provide in English, people won't bother to learn French, and so if you only provide it in French, that will help to maintain the French-Canadian culture. And there's a similar argument with the education example, that you have a right to have signs, to be given access to information, but the particular language in which that information is delivered can be restricted for the purposes of maintaining and protecting a certain culture. So using the test case of Quebec, Taylor argues that it is sometimes acceptable for the government to intervene to protect a culture and to create certain laws or impose certain restrictions which might not otherwise be acceptable if they're created for the purposes of recognizing an identity or a cultural difference and valuing it. He does recognize that there are problems with this view. In particular, he says, look, it's maybe easier to do in a situation like Quebec, where there's a relatively large number of French Canadians there, and they're trying to maintain their culture. But it calls into question how we might meet all of the various demands for recognition that a society might be asked to meet. If you have a society, for example, in the United States, where you have many, many, many different cultures coming together, it becomes very difficult to recognize each one. And Taylor says, yeah, sometimes it is very difficult, and he thinks that it might be the case that not every culture is deserving of equal recognition, but that there are some cultures which are particularly important in that society, or which are in danger of dying out, or which are particularly prevalent but underrepresented, for example, in education, which the government ought to step in and protect. So he says, look, this is an area where we can only do the best we can. There are sort of practical limits to what's possible, but yet we ought to do as much as possible to maintain fundamental rights, maintain the view towards equality, while also recognizing and prioritizing collective identity and difference, so that we can preserve different cultures, so that we can have a truly multicultural society and not run the risk of homogenizing society and allowing important cultures to die out. So now that we've seen Taylor's initial argument, we're going to look at one of the counterarguments that existed in the book that this came from, and that is Identity, Authenticity, Survival, Multicultural Societies, and Social Reproduction by K. Anthony Appiah. So Appiah agrees with Taylor that issues of recognition have become important, and in fact that recognition is important, both on an individual level and on a political level. Right? He says it is important to recognize people, to see them as they are, as they would like to be seen, to not cover over difference, but to embrace it and accept people as they are. However, he also thinks that alongside this issue of recognition comes issues of authenticity and autonomy, and that identity and autonomy have to work together. And so in particular, he is reticent to agree with Taylor about the importance of the politics of difference, and especially about the idea that it's appropriate for government to intervene in order to promote collective identity groups. He thinks that it is much more important to view recognition as an individual interpersonal affair, and for the government to protect autonomy. So that's going to be the sort of main course of his argument. So whereas Taylor focuses on the politics of difference versus the politics of equality, Appiah focuses on what he calls individual identity versus collective identity. Individual or personal identity has to do with a particular person's particular request for recognition. Like Taylor, he recognizes that each individual has an identity that they create themselves in conjunction with their society, in conjunction with how they're seen by others. And Appiah argues that we ought to prioritize individual or personal identity. And he contrasts this with collective identity, a focus on culture, race, gender, any sort of religion, any collective identity group that a person might be a part of or might appear to be a part of. Right? And he argues that Taylor is focusing on collective identity, whereas we ought to focus on individual or personal identity. That if a particular person would like to be recognized for their culture or their race or anything like that, then that's fine. But that we shouldn't focus on that. Instead, we should focus as a sort of large-scale government project, but we should just focus individually, interpersonally, on personal identity. Right? And so instead of propping up collective identity groups, we should just see individuals as they would like to be seen. That is Appiah's claim. And this is because he sees the over-focus on collective identity groups, as is sometimes expressed in modern identity politics, to be dangerous for various reasons. In particular, he argues that when we focus on collective identity, we end up over-scripting people's lives. He notes that even though individuals do have some ability to create ourselves, as we explained in the beginning with Taylor, this is not complete control. Right? According to Appiah, our identity is created from options that are already given to us by our society. We are necessarily restricted in our abilities to become what we would like to be by the facts of the world, where we live, the context in which we live, the way that people view us and treat us. Those are all limiting factors. People have certain expectations based upon how we look, how we present ourselves, what the society says is right or wrong for different types of people. And so we're already limited in how we can create our identities. And by focusing on collective identity groups too much, he says we limit people even more. He's very concerned about this idea of scripting, that the society, just by virtue of people living together, already imposes some restrictions on how we can express ourselves, and that overly focusing on collective identity will just impose further restrictions. So instead, Appiah argues we ought to, in particular the government, ought to focus on autonomy, right? That while individual people in relation to one another should accept the way that a person has expressed their identity, we should value identity socially and interpersonally, that the government's role is not to promote collective identities in the way that Taylor has argued, but instead is to promote autonomy. Appiah says that liberalism is a fighting creed and that its purpose, the purpose of Western liberal democracies, is to promote autonomy and to protect autonomy as much as possible. So instead of imposing culture through focus on the politics of difference and through perhaps government intervention, like we saw in the Quebec example, Appiah argues that the government should promote autonomy and freedom as much as it can, and then individual people can embrace a culture or not. Right? So if we look back at Taylor's Quebec example, Appiah would say that it's not appropriate for the Canadian government to allow Quebec to impose language requirements, but instead that the French-Canadian people should try to develop a culture that people would like to be a part of, so that they would volunteer, for example, to send their kids to French school rather than make it mandated. Right? That the government's role should be to protect autonomy and freedom rather than protecting cultures. The ideal situation, according to Appiah, is one in which we value the personal dimensions of self and we respect personal or individual autonomy and request for recognition rather than focusing on collective identity. So we've sort of said that already. And he offers a personal example to try to make this claim clear. And so he uses race and sexual orientation, using himself as the kind of test case. Appiah is African American, or black as he would say, and gay. He's quite famous in the contemporary political philosophy and social philosophy spheres for arguing in several places that race, for example, does not exist, that it is a social construct, that it is absolutely meaningless. And so he says, for example, if we adopt a focus on collective identity, then he will be forced to have as part of his identity his blackness. But for him, it's not a real thing. It's not something that he wants to embrace. He thinks that it's meaningless. And so it would be limiting his freedom to require that he be seen that way. And he says something similar about sexual orientation. Maybe it's something that he values personally, but he doesn't think that it should have any sort of political importance. Right? He would rather a life where he is just free to be who he wants, instead of a life which includes scripting. Right? So I'm just going to read a little bit from the penultimate paragraph of his article, on page 162, 163, where he kind of uses these examples of his own identity to argue against Taylor. So he says that he says, I'm sympathetic to the stories of gay and black identity that I've told in the preceding in the rest of the article. I see how the story goes. It may even be historically, strategically necessary for the story to go this way. But I think we need to go on to the next necessary step, which is to ask whether the identities constructed in this way are ones I speak here as someone who counts in America as a black gay man, can be happy with in the long run. Demanding respect for people as blacks and as gays requires that there are some scripts that go with being an African American or having same-sex desires. There will be proper ways of being black and gay. There will be expectations to be met. Demands will be made. It is at this point that someone who takes autonomy seriously will ask whether we have not replaced one kind of tyranny with another. So he's concerned here that if we prioritize politically these sorts of collective identities, we start requiring people to act in a certain way in order to conform to the identities that we think they have, or that they maybe really do have, right? And so he's concerned that this is limiting autonomy, right? So he continues, if I have to choose between the world of the closet and the world of gay liberation, or between the world of Uncle Tom's Cabin and Black Power, I will, of course, choose in each case the latter, right? If it's one or the other, of course, he would rather live in a society which is more open, even if it's a scripted kind of openness. But it continues, but I would like not to have to choose. I would like other options. The politics of recognition requires that one's skin color, one's sexual body should be acknowledged politically in ways that make it hard for those who want to treat their skin and their sexual body as personal dimensions of the self. And personal means not secret, but not too tightly scripted. I think, and Taylor, I gather, does not, that the desire of some Quebecois to require people who are ethnically francophone to teach their children in French steps over a boundary. I believe, to pronounce on a topic Taylor does not address, that this is in some sense the same boundary that is crossed by someone who demands that I organize my life around my race or my sexuality. So that's the end of the quote. So essentially what Appiah is saying here is the ideal political situation is one in which we focus on identity on an individual, personal level rather than on a political level. And so instead of a government imposing restrictions or loosening restrictions to allow for political groups centered around identity to be promoted, he thinks the government should promote autonomy, and any of these issues of identity should just be worked out on individual personal basis. And that's the way in which we can reduce scripting and allow people a maximum freedom to express their identities in the way that they would like to. Right? So hopefully we can see here with both Taylor and Appiah's approaches that both recognize the importance of recognition. Both recognize that we as human beings have certain identities, and those identities should be respected. But where they differ is in the value that they give these identities in terms of political and government value. Right? That while recognition is personally and individually important, and identity is personally and individually important, Taylor also holds that it is politically important, whereas Appiah argues that it is not, or at least that it should not be. That our ultimate goal should be a society in which identity is limited to the personal, and the politics and governments do not have to get involved.